All right, welcome. Today, we're jumping into a foundational method in qualitative research that's super powerful, but, often a little misunderstood. We're going to break down thematic analysis using the landmark 2006 paper by Virginia Brown and Victoria Clark as our guide. It's the go-to for so many researchers because it's flexible, it's powerful, and it's just a fantastic way to build the core skills you need for pretty much any qualitative work. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so picture this. You've done all the hard work. You've been out there conducting interviews, you've gathered your texts, maybe you've got a ton of open-ended survey responses, and now you're just staring at this mountain of rich, complex data. The big question is, how do you find the story that's hiding inside all of that? I know it can feel overwhelming, but trust me, there is a systematic way to find those meaningful patterns. And that's where thematic analysis comes in. So in this explainer, we're going to cover exactly what it is, we'll define its core component, the theme, and then we'll walk through a really practical 6-phase guide to actually doing it. We're also going to look at some common pitfalls to avoid, compare it to another popular method, and then wrap up with some tips on how to become a really great analyst. All right, let's kick things off with the big question. What exactly is thematic analysis, or TA as you'll often hear it called? Honestly, you should think of it as an essential tool in your toolbox, a foundational skill that every single qualitative researcher should have in their back pocket. So at its heart, Braun and Clark tell us that TA is a method for identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns or themes within your data. Now here's the really important part. It's not just about sorting your data or summarizing it. It's an active process of interpretation. You're making sense of everything you've gathered, and you're telling a story about it. I love this slide because it really gets to why TA is so popular. People often call it the Swiss Army knife of analysis, and for good reason. It's incredibly flexible. Unlike some other methods, it isn't locked into one specific theory. That makes it super accessible for beginners, and it gives you those core skills, like coding, that you're going to use in almost any other kind of qualitative analysis. And, that flexibility carries right over into how you actually approach your data. You can go with an inductive or bottom-up approach. That's where your themes come directly from the data. You let the data itself lead the way. Or you could use a theoretical top-down approach. This is where your analysis is guided by a specific question or a theory you already have in mind. Okay, so that brings us to the absolute core of this whole thing, the theme. What exactly counts as a theme? Well, it's way more than just counting how many times a word pops up. This is the key right here. A theme isn't defined by how often it appears, but by how important it is. It's something that captures a significant pattern in your data that helps you answer your main research question. A theme could be all over your data, or it might just pop up a few times but be incredibly insightful. And that's where you, the researcher, come in. It's your judgment call to figure out what's really key to the story. Now this is cool. You can look for themes on 2 different levels. Braun and Clark use this great analogy. Think of your data like a blob of jelly. A semantic analysis is just describing the surface of the jelly. You're looking at what people are explicitly saying, the obvious meanings. But a latent analysis asks, what gives that jelly its shape? You're digging deeper, interpreting the underlying ideas, the assumptions, and the social context behind what's being said. So it's the difference between what someone literally says and what their words imply about the bigger picture. All right, so we know what TA is, and we know what a theme is. But how do you actually do it? Let's walk through the 6-phase recipe for analysis that Braun and Clark laid out for us. So the process basically goes like this. You start by getting really familiar with your data, then you generate some initial codes, and from those codes, you start searching for broader themes. After that, you'll review those themes, define and name them, and finally, write it all up. And just a heads up, this isn't always a straight line from 1 to 6. You'll probably find yourself looping back and forth between these steps as you learn more, and that's totally normal. And this is such a great, honest look at the process. This is what's called a thematic map from phase 3. When you're searching for themes, you've got all your codes, you're starting to see how they might group together. It looks like a total mess, right? A bit chaotic? Guess what? That is completely 100% normal. This is what making sense of complexity looks like in the beginning. And then, this is the payoff. By the time you get to phases 4 and 5, reviewing and defining your themes, all that initial chaos starts to get refined. It turns into a clear, structured story. You can literally see how those initial ideas have been tweaked and organized into a final map that tells you something really compelling about your data. Okay, so now that we've seen the ideal process, let's talk about some of the common traps people fall into. Because a good analysis isn't just about following the steps, it's also about avoiding the mistakes that can really weaken your work.
The number one thing to remember is that you need to analyze, not just summarize. Don't just rephrase what your participants said, that's just description. A classic mistake is using your interview questions as your themes. That really stops you from finding the true patterns. You want to make sure your themes are strong and distinct, and, maybe most importantly, your claims have to be backed up by your data. If you say something is a theme, you've got to show the receipts. You need to back it up with powerful quotes.
All right, now that we've got a good handle on TA, let's zoom out a bit. How does it stack up against another popular method you've probably heard of, grounded theory? So this table breaks it down really nicely. Thematic analysis, as we've seen, is all about finding and reporting patterns to give a rich interpretation of your data. Grounded theory, on the other hand, has a much more specific goal: to build a brand new theory from the ground up that's grounded in the data. So TA is theoretically flexible, while grounded theory is really tied to its own set of procedures for that theory building process. So when it comes down to it, how do you choose? Well, in a nutshell, if your goal is to really understand your data and provide a rich, detailed story about the patterns you find, thematic analysis is a fantastic choice. But if your goal is to generate an entirely new theory from scratch, that's when you turn to grounded theory. It's all about picking the right tool for the job. All right, let's wrap this up with our final section: how to go from just doing thematic analysis to doing it really, really well. Here are 3 huge tips, especially for beginners, that'll help you build a solid foundation. First, immerse yourself. Seriously, read and reread your data until you know it inside and out. Second, code inclusively. Don't just grab a tiny snippet. Keep enough of the surrounding text so you have context. And remember, a single piece of data can totally fit into more than one theme. And third, be reflexive. This is huge. Themes don't just magically appear. You, the researcher, are an active participant in constructing the analysis. And this quote from Braun and Clark really nails that last point. Good research is transparent research. To show that you're being thoughtful and rigorous, you need to be explicit about your own assumptions when you write up your report. What's the lens you're looking through? Being upfront about that is what separates good research from great research. And last but not least, when you get to writing your report, think of yourself as a storyteller with evidence. Your job is to weave a narrative that's compelling, that makes sense, and that doesn't just repeat itself. And you do that by using vivid quotes and extracts from your data, not just as proof, but as illustrations that bring your analysis to life and make your whole argument incredibly convincing. So look, thematic analysis is this amazing, flexible, and really powerful toolkit. It gives you a clear path to work through all that complex data to make sense of it and to uncover the rich stories that are waiting inside. The story is there. The only question is, are you ready to go find it? And that's a wrap on our guide to thematic analysis. Thanks so much for tuning in.